push you a little bit on your warm glow theory.
Okay.
So you opened that segment by taking a shot at what you characterize as what many evolutionary psychologists say. I would say it's actually very few evolutionary psychologists, but be that as it may. And that's that that selection should. So your critique of the inability to determine whether an interaction is a one-shot or an iterated interaction. Your critique of that position was that selection should essentially either do the math or create the ability to do the math to generate the expected utility and make a decision on the basis of that. And then you went on to say the reason that people do the right thing is because there has been selection that favors the knowledge, the ability to recognize in others a consistent pattern of behavior such that those people, you put it, they blush when they do the wrong thing, they give you back the $10,000 because they feel bad if they didn't, and so on. Right? And those two statements are at odds with each other. Right? So if the first statement is true, then the second statement is not. Because if it's the case that selection can or should favor the ability to calculate the expected utility, then there ought not to be any individuals who feel bad when the payoff is big enough. Okay? So it's not, I don't know what the value is. It's not $10,000, it's $500,000. And I find my best friend's $500,000 on the concert floor. Right? By your expected utility argument, I shouldn't feel any shame at all. I should, put that money in a new bank account and squirrel my assets in ways that my friends can't detect, and enjoy myself. Right?
So is there a question there, or do you want me to just comment on the inconsistency you feel you see?
Okay, I'll phrase it as a question. Which of your two statements is false?
I don't think there's an inconsistency, so I'm gonna go from that angle. First of all, it is true that you often do see more dishonest behavior when the reward to it goes up. Sometimes you see less. I mean, I think if you find $5 on the street corner, you know that if you keep it, the person who lost it isn't going to suffer much, and so it's not worth the trouble. But if it were $100,000 you found, it might be a life-changing event, and so might take more trouble to find and if you did keep it, you'd feel more guilt than if you kept the $5 that you'd found. But I think it's clearly true that there are people who can make the relevant calculation, because there are people who do cheat when they think no one is looking. Maybe they make mistakes and people were looking when they thought not. But I think we know from late career revelations that were people who got away with it forever. They made calculations about cheating when no one was looking, and that's why it always seemed to me that reputation was an unreliable guide to the character of a rational cheater. A rational cheater doesn't cheat when anyone's looking, and so doesn't get caught cheating, and so has a good reputation insofar as no one's ever seen him cheat. So if it's true that people like that, if the number of offspring you leave successfully is just a function of your material payoff, those people should have driven the others out by now. They have not, clearly. And so I take that. It's not that that we can't do the math. There are people who can do the math and do it and do cheat, but there must be some countervailing force that's propping up the ones who don't go down that route. And I think it is a warm glow. And I think what we look for in a partner is somebody we feel cares about our interests as if they were her own interests. Adam Smith and David Hume stressed, they called it sympathy, we would call it empathy probably now. They stress the role of that as a ingredient in interactions that require trust, and I think that's what it's all built upon. When I used to show slides, Joan told me I would be the only speaker in this series who hadn't shown slides in history maybe, but at least in recent memory. I used to show a picture of a young boy who was accompanying his, is it the Sharpie, the Chinese dog with the loose skin? Sharpei, yeah. So the vet has just plunged a syringe into the dog's shoulder here, and the boy is screaming bloody murder. The dog's face is away from where the boy's standing, but you know, it's absolutely clear that he imagines that his dog is feeling pain and is vicariously experiencing his best friend's pain in that moment, and nobody would see that photo. It was, I think, one I found on the back of Life magazine, and say, oh, that kid's pretending to feel the dog's pain. We feel we can make judgments that don't have to be perfect, but if we're right often enough in those judgments, then the people who wouldn't keep your money, they can find a niche too. That's the argument.
I understand. I think perhaps because I was unclear in my phrasing, you responded to an objection that I didn't make. So my objection was not, why isn't the world full of calculating Machiavellian actors who manage reputation? And you mentioned there are such individuals,
yeah.
and we find out retrospectively.
Or never.
Or the ones who tell us and the ones who don't, we never find out. My objection was, why isn't the warm glow mechanism Machiavellian? That is, if it's possible for selection to do the expected utility calculation, why doesn't the warm glow mechanism shut off when the payoffs are sufficiently high? Now, your response to that was, or your response to the argument that you thought I was making was, look, we look around us and we see that the warm glow mechanism exists. People are relatively cooperative. I don't think that that's a legitimate argument. That is the thing to be explained, so it does not validate an explanation about how we got there. We agree that the world is full of cooperative people, that people do experience moral sentiments. Right? So you can't adduce that fact in supporting one version of an explanation against another, when the version that you're supporting is still subject to this criticism that selection ought to have been able to turn that mechanism off when it's worth it.
No, I said that selection, I mean, it's first of all, it's not a binding commitment to do the right thing. It's something that pushes you in the direction of doing the right thing. And I mean, if you talk about the ultimatum game, $10 for me to distribute between me and you, I claim 9 for me, 1 for you. What do you do? A lot of people, probably a majority in this group, would say, I refuse, even though that means we're each going to get nothing. And if you ask people to defend that, you can coax out of them a statement something like, it was worth $1 to me to see the look on his face when he saw that his one-sided offer left him with nothing. And if you then ask people, what if it was $100 million? And he said, 999 million for me, $1 million for you. Most people will say, no, I would accept the million. And they still feel like it was a pretty nasty offer that they were confronted with, but walking away from $1 million is a very painful thing to do compared to walking away from $1. So nobody has shut off any warm glow. I think if you could shut off the warm glow whenever you wanted to and behave strategically, then you couldn't effectively signal anything. People would not have a prior that people who seemed sincere were likely to be sincere, because they would realize that sincerity was all an act. I had a comment from two philosophers, or an economist and a philosopher, who attacked my argument on roughly those grounds, saying emotional expression is all ritualized communication. It's just important that people be able to understand our message, not that it be sincere. And I think that just misconstrues the argument at a deep level. But I don't know if you feel I've gotten to you. I don't say you turn the warm glow off. I just say it can be trumped by, it's not the only thing that's pushing you. It can be trumped by a stronger force.
Just to follow, it seems to me the missing premise in Dan's question is that you could have an override mechanism that turned off the warm glow and not have that be detectable by your partner.
No, that's not a missing premise. So if we truly do the expected utility calculation, that there presumably ought to be situations in which detection, the costs of detection are actually outweighed by the benefits of defection.
Sure.
And under those circumstances, the warm glow mechanism would be superfluous and costly. So it ought to be possible to turn it off, right? But by definition of the objection to the argument assigned to, whether rightly or not, evolutionary psychologists, that selection ought to be able to calculate the expected utility. Now, I mean, I agree with you on the facts of the case, which is that people experience the warm glow, and that people sometimes do things for pecuniary reasons which lead them to suffer subjective costs, right? So they do steal the money, even though they're good people, and they feel bad about it for a long time, right? I agree with you about the facts. What I question is the claim that it is impossible for selection to have created other ones, because that claim is inconsistent with the expected utility.
You know, I'm not going to stand up here and pretend that I know what the constraints are for natural selection to build a nervous system that bleeds uncontrollable symptoms onto the body in various ways. I don't know anything at all about the details of that process. And in fact, for me, the hard step in the argument was to explain how the signal could have evolved in the first stages. Suppose it's a blush that reveals that you're a trustworthy person. The first mutation that produced a trace of a blush, how would anybody know what that meant? It would be completely unintelligible. So it would be a double whammy. It would make you not steal the money, and nobody would know that you were a nice person, so they wouldn't choose you for a position that required trust. So the signaling literature has a simple principle that if there's a signal of something, it has to have arisen in the first instance by pure dumb luck. So the dung beetle example, the dung beetle does well because it looks like a turd. This is a passage in one of Stephen Jay Gould's book, and so birds and other predators leave it alone because they think it's a turd because it looks like one. Well, how did it get to look like one? Unless the first mutation that led to it looking like one was enough to fool the very most nearsighted predator out there, it wouldn't have offered any advantage. And so you couldn't get the second step. Evolution can't look forward and say, if we keep doing this 100 times, it's going to eventually pay off. It doesn't work that way. It's got to result in increase in gene frequency for that mutation right away at each stage. And so the beetle had to have looked accidentally a little bit like a turd to begin with, and then a mutation came along that pushed it over the edge and made it look a little bit more like one, and it was a little safer therefore. And then you can get accretions building because they have that effect. So in the case of moral sentiments, let's imagine that they do lots of things. Go back to the iterated prisoner's dilemma. And I used to worry about Toranaga, the shogun character. Here was the perfectly disciplined guy who could present whatever needed to be presented for the situation, and the perfect cheater, the guy who could behave ruthlessly in any situation. So if you're Attila the Hun and you were in a iterated prisoner's dilemma with somebody, you would want to cooperate on the first move and do something like tit for tat on all the other moves, not because you were a nice person, but because that's the way you'd get the biggest payoff available to you. That was at least Axelrod's argument, and it's still got some power out there. So what's the problem? I want to cooperate in iterated prisoners' dilemmas because I know I'll get more money. Well, here's something we know that people are really bad at, animals too. We're really bad at passing up a current reward for a bigger one that we could get in the future. And that's the essential property of an iterated prisoner's dilemma. You can get a big gain now or an even bigger gain if you're disciplined now and you don't take what's on the table now and you cooperate and get a string of cooperations that run out into the future. I want to do that, but I can't. I'm not disciplined enough. The gain now blinds me, and so I cheat. I can't build a good reputation if that's what's driving me. If I then have a moral sentiment that makes me sympathetic to my kids, so that when caring for them requires all sorts of onerous things that I wouldn't want to do, and I know that if I don't do them in the future, that'll be problematic. The fact that I care directly right now about my kids gets me to do them. The sympathy I have for them gets me to do that. If I had sympathy that made me cooperate now in an iterated prisoner's dilemma, I'd be better able to build a good reputation. And so it wouldn't be that caring about the other guy was the main thing. It was just I happen to care about him, and I can build on that. Then selection can take whatever, and there might be an uncontrollable manifestation of that. When a dog gets aroused to do battle, the hairs on its back stand up on end totally without him thinking about it. So when I'm feeling sympathetic, who knows? So there's all sorts of electrical firestorms going off in the brain. What do they do that people can see? I don't know. Are there constraints on other people's ability to mimic those if others have a head start because of this process where moral sentiments were just useful in building good reputations? That's a hard question to answer, but it's certainly a plausible account, I think, if you look at the structure of it.
The sort of argument for reputation seems to be somewhat, in the end, you're almost sort of going towards what's going on sort of current day politics, which seems to be the opposite of what we possibly see in most of other, animal world. So the bull elk gets larger antlers because the one with the largest convinces the females that he's the best. But if you look at what's going on, say, in the current politics, is you're not convincing necessarily you're the best candidate. You're just better than this other person whose reputation you're really running down. So it seems almost like a spiteful game. I mean, the negative campaigning, negative politics casts a negative aspersion on your reputation. Everybody thinks you're a worse person or a worse political party, but as long as you convince that the other guys are even worse, you're doing better. So it seems like it's
That's
almost
Darwin's central idea. Life's graded on the curve. I can be bad, but if you're worse, I win.
But the idea of almost being spiteful behavior is not. I mean, the peacock doesn't convince the peahens that all the other peacocks suck.
Oh, I agree. It's way better to have a race to the top than a race to the bottom. Yeah. But it's still all about relative payoffs, and that's the truly pernicious dimension of the Citizens United decision, because it lets a billionaire give money to a PAC, which then independently has the slime ads running against the candidate they're trying to defeat, and the candidate on whose behalf they're actually running says, I didn't do it, I can't control these guys. And we're going to see in this round what that results in. It's not going to be pretty, I predict.
But then the dealing with this sort of thing, again, for the group benefit, is it the same prescription for a race to the top that's hurtful for the group as opposed to a race to a bottom that's also hurtful for the group?
You could say before Citizens United, we had a collective restraint on the way campaign money could be spent. Now we don't have that, and I think the outcome we're going to get is going to be markedly worse. You don't always get arms control agreements. When one side thinks it has an advantage, they won't negotiate an arms control agreement. It was said, I don't think this is true, but it was said that Reagan deliberately launched the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars, because he knew it would bankrupt the Soviet Union. That's too complicated by half, I think, probably, to be a credible account. Mark would know better than me, but there certainly are situations like that. George Steinbrenner, the late owner of the Yankees, a thug by every account, resisted to the end any attempt to have payroll caps or revenue sharing in baseball, not because he didn't understand that they could all field competitive teams with a lot less expense if they had those things, but because he knew he had the Yes Network and the $1 billion worth of cable revenue coming in each year, and he could just outbid the others, and the championships he could buy that way would make it worth it to spend all the extra money. So yeah, it's hard to regulate when you're in a situation where the people who have the power, I'm doing a piece on this right now. It looks like we're really trapped. The people with the money are giving a lot more to campaigns. The politicians are dependent upon them. In return, they give the people who give the money what they want, which has been so far more money. They want lower taxes, laxer regulation, so they get more money. That lets them buy more of what they want, which is more money still. And so you've got a positive feedback loop that we're just caught in. Where's the way out of that? And I think there isn't any way out of that unless you can persuade the people who are doing the buying that what they're buying isn't worth a damn. You're buying, here's a thought experiment. Who's happier? People in a society in which the rich drive $150,000 Mercedes sedans on well-paved roads, that's society one, or one in which they drive $200,000 Bentleys on pothole-ridden roads with foot-deep potholes every few feet. The second one is the one we live in. Which one do you think the rich would be happier in? You know, it's just an easy question. The Bentley is a good car. Maybe it's better than the Mercedes, but it's not much better. And driving it on a really bad road overall makes for a way worse experience than driving the Mercedes on a good road. So why won't they approve higher taxes so we can fix the roads? That's the interesting question. And I think it's possible to persuade them that they're making a grave error by their opposition to the steps that it would take to rebuild things in the public sphere.
I have two questions versus a flippant one. Do you tip when you're traveling in the...
I do, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The second is...
Sometimes I send the bill to my hosts. You know, the choice on the cab receipt was 10%, 15%, 20%. And I checked 20%. And I'm thinking I was being nice, and then I realized I was going to send that receipt to the seminar organizers.
So the more serious question is, what are your policy recommendations, really, for dealing with, one of the bigger tragedy of the commons, and that is carbon use?
Again, that's such an easy question to answer if you think about it. I mean, they say, oh, the climate science is uncertain, thinking somehow that means you don't have to do anything. It's uncertain. That means it could be better than we think. But uncertain means it could be worse than we think. And if you look at the range of estimates that are, they're imperfect to be sure. That's the first thing the climate scientists will tell you, that they're very uncertain. But they have a very long tail, and the MIT simulation model estimates a 10% chance that we'll have a more than 12-degree Fahrenheit temperature increase by the end of this century, which means the permafrost melts, all the methane goes up, 50 times more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. We could just throw that fear out the window with a really stiff carbon tax. You got to tax something. Why not tax carbon? Every dollar you raise taxing carbon, you could tax something else $1 less. And look, if you had a $300 a ton carbon tax, that would mean the price of gas would go up $3 a gallon. It's already $6 a gallon more in Europe than it is here, and they're not unhappy. They're driving cars that get better gas mileage, and they spend less on gas even at their high prices than we do. You could trade in your Ford Bronco 14 miles a gallon for a Ford Fusion, or the new station wagon that gets 35 miles a gallon and has more cargo hauling capacity and handles better. You'd spend no more even if you drove the same amount. That's inexplicable that we can allow the political system just to block any attempt to do anything about that. It's more complicated, obviously. You got to get China and India and everybody else on board. But if the threat is that we're all going to die, then that's a very bad outcome, and it must mean that there's a transfer payment that could be made that would make it in everyone's interest to have a carbon tax. Instead, they're subsidizing fuel in India. Fuel is sold at below market rates. gas consumption goes up there, and here it goes down because it's gradually getting more expensive.
I actually have an interesting idea, or I'm wondering about this. So you make this whole argument that we do have the warm glow. We do, there is a lot of cooperation at this sort of maybe individual level, but then why is it that as nations, like, why aren't we all just saying, you know what, it's in the group best interest? Why do you think there's that dichotomy, or this?
Why aren't we doing all this stuff?
Yeah, well, why is it, the arguments that you make at the sort of individual level, why are they not holding at this larger
I mean, we're not doing lots of stuff that I think it's a no-brainer to do. So I'm the wrong one to ask about that. So if I'm so smart, how come I'm not rich? Is the question you're really asking me, and that's a fair question. I mean, I've made the arguments as clearly as I'm capable of making them, and they're out there. Obviously, people haven't been moved by them to take action, and I'm disappointed by that. I was naive to hope otherwise, probably, but still I'm disappointed.
So a lot of what you've been saying today depends on kind of our ability to infer consistent character traits in people, right? And I like that idea because then it seems like a lot of kind of moral and ethical judgments are as much about figuring out whether someone's a good or a bad person as evaluating whether the actions are right or wrong, which is something some of us have been thinking about. But I guess I'm wondering, it seems like people need to be kind of good at that, right? And you mentioned the experiment you had where you were at 75%. But in psychology, there's kind of a literature documenting that even though people do infer character traits in people, that people don't necessarily actually have those consistent kind of character traits across situations. So I'm wondering, how good does it need to be? Does it need to be something where if somebody's picking up an envelope full of money and returning it to somebody, I can now infer across a wide range of behaviors that they're going to be a good cooperative actor? Or do I only need to make a pretty narrow inference about what they're going to do in some similar economic kind of thing?
Yeah, that is kind of the core idea in social psychology. It's the situation, not the person.
Yeah, do you just not believe that?
And I certainly appreciate that situational forces are enormously important. Ethical decisions are very complicated. I've got some work I'm doing with some colleagues at Cornell where we're exploring why people are so hostile to consequentialist moral philosophers. I don't know if you know the basic debate, but there are the consequentialists who say the right thing to do is the thing that leads to the best overall consequences. And the deontologists say, no, there are just certain principles that you have to follow, consequences be damned. They won't say consequences don't matter, but they'll say there are just certain principles you have to follow. And the two systems make very similar predictions about most moral questions that come up. And so it's natural to wonder, why do the deontologists feel such contempt for the consequentialists? Did you say because they're evil people?
I don't actually think they're evil, but that's some of the kinds of things that we've been talking about, is that, when people are making those judgments, they're not necessarily just evaluating whether it's right to, what action brought out the best outcome. They're making some inference about the person who made the choice.
Right. When you're faced with an interesting moral question, I think they're almost always of the following form. I want to do something. And if I'm a consequentialist, the question is the gain to me sufficient to justify whatever harm what I'm doing might cause to others? Because if the answer to that's yes, then it's okay for me to do it. Because I will have, by definition, done the thing that leads to the best overall consequences. So, it's obviously a tough nut to weigh these consequences in an uncontested metric, but that's the basic issue. And if I'm a consequentialist and I'm trying to decide whether it's okay for me to do something I want to do, I'm the same guy who's going to estimate the relevant costs and benefits that's going to answer that question. And there's always a range of defensible estimates. And so I'll pick benefits to me that are at the high end of the range and costs to others that are at the low end of the range. And so I'll be more likely to do it than probably would be justified on objective, purely unbiased measures. But that's just the first step. Others will see me do that, and then they're going to tilt their their decisions toward doing what they want to do, and you'll get this kind of self-reinforcing dynamic to it. So I think the problem with consequentialism is you may not be able to trust a consequentialist. But if you could, that would be the right moral system.
On a simpler level, I think if we had more data, we would find that we have quick intuitions about people that do tap into these things. There was just a paper in Psychological Science where what they call a brief slice or something, a
Yes.
30-second interaction,
Yes.
a cooperative interaction, that the subjects could detect the oxytocin receptor genotype of their partners better than chance, and the genotype that's associated with cooperative behavior. We don't really ask those questions enough, but I would suspect that we do have a lot of very instantaneous, quick, intuitive judgments that we make just on with faces, eyes,
Right.
movements, that would give us clues as to who's...
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic. My former junior colleague David Sally wrote a marvelous survey of what's known about the development of what he called the sympathy dance. The first impressions are enormously important. If you have every stimulus that comes at you, you rate up or down. There's a positive or negative valence you assign to it, even very neutral seeming stimuli. And then once you've got an initial valence, we're not natural scientists. You look for confirming evidence. And so you look for, when you get an ambiguous signal on round two, you look for some way you can make that consistent with your first impression. And if you have a bad first impression, typically the chain truncates pretty quickly. You don't continue interacting with that person. But as you keep having good experiences, you just develop a closer and closer bond. And there are all sorts of things. Sympathetic mimicry, if your conversation partner does that, you do that too. And it's a marvelous, complex dance that people engage in. And after it's gone on for enough time, people really like each other and don't want to cheat each other is one of the outcomes of it. It doesn't mean they never do, but, long courtships are a part of most cultures. It's the important relationships. You spend a lot more time assessing those sorts of things than the ones that don't have a lot at stake in them.
I have difficulty with the way I understand your story. So you say individuals develop this warm, glow feeling so that they end up developing a good reputation and are paid off later. But if that's the story, I would have expected natural selection to have, a bit on the lines of Manifesto, to have produced individuals with a different mechanism in which when you know that you are competing, that no one is observing, you just shut off this warm feeling. And that's not that's observed.
So the question is, to what extent do you have control over these blink moral emotions? I mean, what we know is that when people see scenes in videos, the emotional arousal occurs instantaneously. If the reason sympathy evolved was to help get you off your butt to take care of your kid in distress, then it's going to be pretty deeply entrenched in the brain, probably for that reason alone. And then can natural selection then start working on that and build a fork off of that to disable sympathy in certain situations? Maybe, but maybe not.
Maybe not, but that's where I feel uncomfortable with. That's, we don't need group selection. That's enough. I mean, these difficulties is where I start feeling the need for groups which have people who are more proactive, do better. And I start finding a way out of these difficulties. I think
Don't for a minute think that the rules and enforcement of norms and things like that aren't important. That's a huge part of the. I mean, we're very contingent in the way we size up moral responsibilities. If you if you look at tax compliance, once people know that their neighbors aren't paying their taxes, tax cheating goes up very fast. And the idea that you need to have enforcement mechanisms, surveillance mechanisms to keep things on an even keel. I mean, it's possible if you build the right institutions to get people not to cheat when no one's looking. But if you're completely anarchistic about institutions, then probably we're capable of evolving to a point where we reluctantly say, well, yeah, you got to do what you got to do. If no one's looking, you got to cheat, or else you're going to, everyone else is doing it, so you got to do it. That's true. I agree with that.
I also think that it's sort of misguided to think that selection isn't constrained in any way, and that you will always reach kind of what you think of as the most favored situation, because it's been shown in more biological situations that there are constraints on trait evolution.
You have to build on what's already there, and what's already there may not be at all well suited for the next step you think that would be good to take. I mean, what's his name? Gary, author of Cluj. Gary Marcus argues that if you look at the architecture of the brain, it's the clearest evidence for the kind of thing you're talking about. No one would design a computer the way the brain is designed, a memory system the way ours is. It's just, it had to be built on what was there in the round previous. And so it's just a hodgepodge. Thank you very much.